Can you all see me? Okay. Can you all see me and hear me, I hope? Before we begin, I want to briefly announce our third event to be held on Friday, July 22nd at 3 p.m. As always, it's free to our members, but requires registration to receive the link to attend, just like you did today. It's a poetry reading by three of Portland's finest practitioners of the art: Tim Gillespie, author of Old Stories, Some Not True, and Other Poems; Suzanne Sigafus, author of This Swarm of Light; and John Morrison, author of Monkey Island. All have given numerous readings at Broadway Books and other venues over the years. In my opinion, they are all excellent poets, and I hope you join us. Today, it is my great pleasure to introduce Carolyn Wood, a writer, yoga practitioner, intrepid traveler, gardener, beekeeper, and retired English teacher. Carolyn has written 2 memoirs that document her long and extraordinary life. Without revealing too much, I will say a few words about each one of them. And after attending this event, I hope you will want to read one or both of them. They are available at Broadway Books, as well as other independent bookstores in Portland and the Multnomah County Library. Her first memoir, published in 2018 by Sasquatch Books in Seattle, is called Tough Girl: Lessons in Courage and Heart from Olympic Gold to the Camino de Santiago. It's a coming-of-age story of Carolyn's heartbreak and ultimate triumph as a 14-year-old member of the U.S. Olympic swim team at the 1960 Olympic Games in Rome. About 50 years after that, she embarked on a solo pilgrimage to walk the Camino de Santiago trail in northern Spain. In Tough Girl, Carolyn also reflects on coming out as gay in the 1970s after a brief marriage and motherhood, and the disillusionment and loss she experienced when her longtime post-marriage relationship suddenly ended. She met this loss by deciding to summon up her inner tough girl that she was at age 14 to walk the 500 miles of the legendary Camino by herself. These memories are artfully woven together with details of her life before, during, and after the 50-year time span. Carolyn's second memoir, published in 2021 by White Pine Press in Portland, is called Class Notes: A Young Teacher's Lesson from Classroom to Kennedy Compound. In this book, she writes about taking a day off from her first year of teaching high school English to volunteer for Robert F. Kennedy's presidential campaign in 1968 when it came to Portland. Invigorated by the senator's energy and upbeat message, she was determined to work for the change she hoped would be possible with RFK as president. Just a few short months later, as we all remember, he was assassinated. Soon after, she was invited to move to Hyannisport, Massachusetts, to become the family's governess. This account follows her journey from the classroom into the Kennedy compound, where she tended a group of 10 boisterous children with one on the way, who were all still reeling from their father's sudden and traumatic death. From inside the compound, she learned much about the glimmer of fame and how it can fade. The young teacher who sought worldliness and sophistication discovered instead the value of having just enough. This book will be available as an audiobook later this year, and Carolyn is the narrator of her own story. Today, Carolyn's going to talk to us today about luck and fortune. She has been blessed by both, but her beautifully written books demonstrate that it takes discipline, mindfulness, dedication, resilience, and determination to turn luck and fortune into a meaningful and rewarding life. Welcome, Carolyn Wood.
Wow, thank you very much, Roberta. Um, I don't feel like I have anything else to say, but yes, of course, we always have more to say. Um, I want to thank Joan also and Terry for making this possible, and the villages for inviting me. It's been a rough go getting word out about books since COVID, since many bookstores don't have readings. So I really appreciate this opportunity. I know about the village concept because a neighbor actually is involved out here in the Southwest. But I think you should also know that I'm living in the same house that I was brought home to when I was born. I bought it from my parents. I've been in it for 76 and a half years, with only 1 year not living in Oregon, and that was that year at the Kennedys. So here's my village. And if I am lucky enough to write a third book, I think I want to write something about the history of this house. The notion of luck and fortune comes from a lecture by Tina Seelig, a professor at Stanford University. And I gave a talk to the Associated University Women a couple of weeks ago. And I was thinking about fortune and luck and Edith Green and Title IX, which weave just briefly into this most recent memoir. Seelig defines fortune as that which happens to us that's out of our control. But luck, she says, is constantly blowing around us, but we need to set out a sail to catch its wind. We need to take little risks, to be observant and open-minded and optimistic and gracious and grateful in order to catch good luck. Both of those forces play together throughout our lives. And I realized as I wrote that lecture that in writing both memoirs, I've really been exploring how luck and fortune played throughout my life. First, in the first book, I was trying to explain how a 14-year-old girl from Beaverton, Washington County, made it onto the US Olympic team and won gold. And then how she ended up in Hyannisport in 1968 and why she chose to be an English teacher for the rest of her career. In that process of writing memoir, I realized that you become kind of a detective, that it's not just dredging up memories or uncovering them, but you kind of act like those police detectives on shows where they have big whiteboards or bulletin boards, and you're trying to connect evidence and people and motives and patterns of thought and behavior of other people and of yourself. And you try to answer questions that you have about why what happened to you happened. So in Tough Girl, as Roberta said, I examined my childhood training and how that those many hours of training and competition informed how I taught and then prepped me for walking that Camino. Class Notes centers around two pivotal experiences: my first year teaching in 1967, and then that year at the Kennedys, and how luck and fortune played into them. Fortune, I'm going to say, dictated that in 1962, every Oregon junior, or at least I thought this, was required to write a term paper on an American author. I think that was in the state curriculum. At any rate, at Beaverton, that was my fortune. But it was my luck to choose Stephen Crane. my sale went up and I wanted to catch someone who hadn't written anything that was too long. And I knew that Stephen Crane had only written one novel and a couple of novellas, and I was busy training, so that seemed like a good choice. But it was also my discovery of a short story that stayed with me through 50, 60 years. And that was a short story called An Experiment in Misery, where the narrator spends a weekend or a period of time on the Bowery in New York among the houseless, unemployed men during a time of recession, 1890s. Later, reading Thoreau and then teaching it for 12 years, I became very interested in the notion of a 2-year experiment, his experiment, where he chose to live alone, basically alone, and to have time in order to experiment, think, and read. So I felt like that year that I spent at the Kennedys was my chance to do an experiment in seeing how rich people live or powerful people. Although I'm not sure at that time that was my intention. I was just sort of swept up in the luck of going to work. It was also my fortune to have parents who could afford to send me to college. And while I was at University of Oregon, I took a US history class from Dr. Stevenson and was lucky enough to have the grades to be asked to be in a seminar spring term. In that class, he suggested to us that we write a wild thoughts notebook, that it was a time in our lives when we would have experiences that were very heightened and that we might want to be able to look back on them. And I took him at his word and began to take notes in yellow legal pads. And I kept that journal off and on, not really a daily journal or a diary, but just a wild thoughts notebook for the next 10 or 12 years. And I've persisted in journaling when I traveled or was having out of the ordinary experiences. And in fact, started one 2 years ago in January of, whenever that was, 2020, January of 2020, which was going to be my 75th year. And I thought, I'm going to document my thoughts as I move towards 75. Well, within 6 weeks, we were into the COVID pandemic. And so it became a notebook for both. So backing up, I want to think just a little bit about the setting. Class Notes takes place from 1967 to 1970, just those 3 years. But if you think back to the whole 1960s, when many of us were of an age where we remember things, that were powerful. I was just beginning my sophomore year when John Kennedy was elected, the first president that was born in the 20th century. That was a time when we had dress codes in college, and we had closing hours, and we had sleeping porches where the windows were always open. Probably a relic of the 1918 flu epidemic, I realize now. When people all slept together, you kept the windows open. From 67 to 70, in June of 67 was the 6-day Arab-Israeli war. I was in New York when that war broke out, working as a nanny, and thought I was going to die in New York. It was so scary. It was the summer of riots all across America, the long, hot summer, even in Portland. there was the ongoing Vietnam War constantly. The first boy from my grade school and high school died in Vietnam in the fall of 1967. Then came the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and then Robert Kennedy. That summer, the chaotic Democratic convention in Chicago, and the election of Richard Nixon. Also in the fall were the 1968 Olympics in Mexico City and the Black Power symbols by John Thomas. Muhammad Ali refused to be drafted and lost his heavyweight crown. But it was also in 68 that the Yellow Submarine came out. And that was shortly followed by the White Album, which some of you may remember. And then that next summer, we landed a man on the moon. And at the end of my second year of teaching came the Kent State riots and the Portland State riots. All these events percolate in the background of class notes. But the foreground is this 22-year-old who sort of is aware of all this happening outside, but is still pretty caught up in what's happening to her. "1967 was a world without computers or cell phones or digital cameras. Long distance phone calls cost $5 a minute. Film came in rolls of 12, 24, or 36. And if you recall, you would take them someplace, Red Myers perhaps, and then you'd wait a week or 10 days to see if anything turned out on them. And people wrote letters to each other. They also sent tape recordings. So my friends who had husbands in Vietnam began to send 3-inch tapes back and forth with messages. So when I went to the Kennedys, I had the good fortune to have parents who not only took good care of me and sent me to college, but they kept my scrapbooks and they kept my letters and they got a tape recorder and we began to send tapes back and forth to each other. And all those tapes ended up in the attic of this house where I'm still living. So I'm going to start by just reading a little from the prologue of class notes. Years after I retired from teaching, while emptying the attic for new insulation, I pulled down the swimming scrapbooks my mother had so carefully kept throughout my racing days, and I set to work telling that story. It became Tough Girl. I found another container up there in the attic, a long red and white cardboard box that had once held Christmas wrapping. In it, my mother had stored all the letters I'd written home from the year I spent at the Kennedys. She'd typed them out in duplicate so she could share them with neighbors and friends. The Beaverton High newspaper, yellow and brittle, carried a letter I'd sent to the student body describing my duties and encouraging them to someday take a wild step into the unknown, as I did the day I began campaigning for Robert Kennedy. You never know where that first step will lead you. I'm sure that you'll find your own adventure. Believe me, it's worth the effort. Pictures of the kids taken those first weeks on Cape Cod in August 1968, and later throughout the year at Hickory Hill, filled 2 photo albums. My mom had stored in a plastic bag the little 3-inch reel-to-reel audio tapes that we'd sent back and forth because long-distance phone calls seemed too expensive. I counted 25. Will they still play, I wondered. There were a ski race bib from Sun Valley and some cards and drawings from the kids, mass cards and the program from Roy's baptism in January 1969. The trove had been roasting and freezing up in the attic for over 40 years. Who even has a tape player anymore? After I hauled that long red and white box down the attic ladder, I worked my way through the letters and journals, postcards and articles from the Kennedy Time, talked with former colleagues, reconnected with friends. Memories and stories returned from that extraordinary and ordinary year. When the audio tapes came back from the lab digitized, I sat at my desk for several minutes before clicking play, reluctant to hear what might or might not be on those recordings. Through a back window, my computer open before me, I looked out onto the same green plot where my parents had built their home some 80 years before, and watched the limbs on a grand fir lift and drop, ferns tremble under a spring rain. And then I listened. The high, young voice that came forth, so confident and funny, made me doubt that it was really me. But when my parents spoke, my father's voice deliberate and formal, his expressions so familiar, and my mother interrupting him with laughter and meandering stories, time overlapped for a moment, with me at my desk and back in 1968 simultaneously. I was eavesdropping on ghosts. So I'm going to take a second here and play for you just an excerpt from let's see, I don't want that. Oh, just a moment. Where is my... Just a sec here. Let's get rid of that and that. There it is.
This is your loyal friend speaking from the Robert Kennedy guest house, better known as the haunted house around this area. It's about 10:30 and I'm just about ready for bed as soon as I finish this little gem to you all. Not much happened today. Lee, the secretary, is leaving for a week, and I don't know what's going to happen. And she's been giving me warnings about how difficult the job's going to be and everything, and whose hair to stay out of and that sort of stuff. We had a slight blow up today, which was pretty interesting. I'm supposed to completely ignore those because if I take them to heart, I'll end up with a nervous breakdown like the last governess. Anyway, she said that Thanksgiving is just a rat race and that Christmas is unbelievable because we decorate the house 3 times. Oh, Jackie came home today, but I haven't seen her yet. And Mother, I would suggest that you be very careful in who you talk to and what you tell them. Oh, keep track of the convention. It could be interesting if Teddy gets the nomination, couldn't it? So I guess I'll just tick off here. The tape is running down and I don't know what to say, but tell the kitty cats hello, and Richard, and Barbara and Betty, and Mrs. Lee and Andrea and Bee and Georgie and Simmons and everybody.
So when I heard that voice on the tape recording, the one that you hear, you get the idea of how excited I was as a 22-year-old and quite gossipy, if I might say so myself. It was quite an alien world. I'm not sure if you can see everything that's on the screen here. I want to, let's see. I want to play this, just part of this slideshow. I don't want that on. Oh, gosh. Oh, yeah, here we go. Okay. So here is me as a first-year teacher at Beaverton High School. the Sunset High School hosted a mock Democratic convention. And it was my good fortune that Gretchen, my friend, taught at Sunset High School and got me tickets. And it was also my fortune that Edith Green, Congresswoman Edith Green, went to the same church and was able to hand deliver the letter that I wrote to the senator. Here he is running on the Oregon coast. This Life magazine cover came out after his death, which was June 6th. By the end of June, I had had a phone call asking me if I could come for the whole year. And there's quite a story around how I actually met the senator, which had a connection with Rayford Johnson, who was in the same Olympics and was Robert Kennedy's bodyguard. On the cover of Look were all the kids. And so I spent the summer memorizing the 10 names of the children, not knowing really who I would be in charge of. Spent time up at Wanna Lake working on my tan. And then when I arrived at the Kennedys, I was put in John Kennedy's bedroom for the first 2 weeks. This was the John Kennedy house, which from my window, I looked out at the Robert Kennedy house. And here was my bedroom. I'm just going to read you one more section here of what it was like to arrive in August of 1968. Mornings on the Oregon coast emerged from forest shadows and gray mist. It almost felt like home when light whispered me awake the next morning after I'd arrived. My eyes blinked to sea green light, a salt-scented breeze ruffling the sheer white curtains. The oil painting caught my eye. Had the driver last night really told me that this was the president's room, that he'd painted this picture? You'll be staying here in Mrs. John's house until she gets back from Europe, Bob said. But thinking that made my heart speed up and my stomach clench. Don't get excited, Carolyn. Get up and get moving. As soon as I looked out the window and saw the sunlight glaring off the Sound, where already a few sailboats skimmed across the blue, I knew I was in a foreign land. From somewhere below, out of sight, children's voices piped high and indistinct. It was time to get out and meet the Kennedys. I took a deep breath and turned away from the window. Downstairs, I retraced the path Bob and I had taken at midnight, following a tall, unruly boxwood hedge along the lawn, aiming for a gap I knew opened into the Robert Kennedy driveway. About halfway across the yard, jitters struck, like they had my first day of teaching. Keep walking, I ordered myself. Overhead, a few gulls hung on the updrafts, white against the clear blue sky. Is anyone watching me? Ahead, the house stood still and quiet, the side door entrance closed. Should I knock? I wondered. Through its window, I could see Joe, plates in hand, in a far-off room. The entry room, which I'd learned was also the secretary's office, there were two working up on the Cape that summer, was empty. I knocked and turned the knob at the same time, and Joe looked up, smiled, and put out his hand to wait. He disappeared and quickly returned, empty-handed. Good morning. Ready to get with it, kid? He asked in a greeting I'd come to know was all Mrs. Kennedy. I followed him past the desks and worn-out sofa, past a carpeted staircase and into the far room. At one end of the dining table, Ethel Skakel Kennedy sat talking on the phone. She looked smaller than I'd expected, but solid, her thick, sun-bleached hair tangled and wild, as if she'd come in from a windstorm, and that leathery brown skin of women who've spent too much time outdoors playing tennis, sailing, skiing, lying out in the sun. Her eyes roved around the room while she talked, catching everything momentarily in her foxy gaze. She'd be on the phone or talking with friends almost every time I saw her those first weeks. Even when she stopped talking, you could hear her. Joe the butler pointed me to a seat at the other end of the table, not at the end, but next to it. Would you care for eggs or cereal this morning for breakfast? Joe asked in his proper English accent. I was afraid I might break out laughing. Wheaties, I said. Mrs. Kennedy glanced up, made eye contact. If anyone else was at the table that morning, I've forgotten them. All my senses focused on her. Perched on the edge of my chair, I slurped at my Wheaties, waiting for the opportunity to introduce myself and present my father's gift. When she finally ended her call, I stood, identified myself, and handed her the little jar of caviar. Terrific, kid. We'll serve it tomorrow night when the Whitakers and the Glens come for dinner. Did she know about the fresh Chinook delivered to Joe the night before? Before I could ask, another call came in and her focus shifted. I pushed on into my first day with no real instructions. What next, I wondered. In the bright entry, a young woman now sat at the desk by the front door. Lee Geisen, Mrs. Kennedy's secretary, who would become my touchstone as the weeks unfolded. This morning, she looked up from the cluttered desk, a cigarette smoldering in the ashtray, and commented, "You must be Carolyn. Welcome to the monkey house." So that was my beginning. I'm just going to run through a few of the slides. Well, yeah. This is Max and Christopher standing in front of the boys' playhouse or their music room. I got to take the girls out to the farm for riding lessons and practice. In this picture are the group that I called the preteen posse. From the left, Maria Shriver, Courtney Kennedy, Caroline Kennedy, and Sydney Lawford. After 2 weeks, Jackie returned from Greece, and here she is with Caroline and John, Teddy and Ethel in the background, Carrie on her little pony. And here's Courtney taking a jump, getting ready for the 3rd annual Kennedy Horse Show. And then a play day where we rode bareback out into a pond, or they did. I was not a horseback rider. This is Christopher George. Again, Maria, Courtney, Caroline at their little swim meet, and me with Chris. Didn't take long to be buddies with the little kids. And here's an invitation for a touch football game up on the Cape with Jackie and Roosevelt Greer. Joe the butler is to the right, Michael in the center, and Courtney. Joe the butler was my buddy through the whole year at Hickory Hill. A scavenger hunt for Courtney's birthday party. In the letter that I sent home to Beaverton High School. And then the stacks of letters that I sent to my parents to keep as my record, and the tapes. And here's Douglas, little Douglas Harriman, sending a tape home. Gaga Goo Goo. Here's Hickory Hill from the left, Courtney, Michael holding Freckles on his lap, and Carrie. Their tennis court. David posing as a superstar football player. We played a lot of touch games, I can tell you that. And then for Halloween, Carrie dressed up as Sonny Bono, maybe. And I'm Frankenstein's monster. This is Lee Geisen, who was my absolute best friend back there besides Joe. Lee had spent 2 years with the Kennedys and 2.5 years in the Peace Corps. Typical calendar for the governess. Christmas. Courtney and Michael, and a surprise birthday party for my 23rd birthday, which happened the week before Christmas. Ina had been the baby nurse, caregiver for the little kids since Kathleen's birth, and the Kennedys supported her until her death at 105. There's Hickory Hill in a snowstorm. Nunu, in the center here, was the baby nurse that came after Rory was born. Michael and Carrie were the godparents. And Douglas loving his little sister. Max's birthday party. Birthday parties always had nice big sheet cakes and lots of decorations. And while I was there, Joe was naturalized. So Nunu and Joe celebrated his beginnings of becoming an American citizen. Christopher and Doug, Courtney and Max, David, and the Apollo rocket launch from the Potomac School football field. The man in the suit is Lem Billings, who was perhaps John Kennedy's best friend and became very involved in sort of shepherding the family after the senator's death. Although he lived in New York, he sort of was the caregiver for Bobby Jr. And here we are, waiting for the big launch. In the spring, my mother, to the right, and her best friend, Georgie Gabriel, came back to visit, and they were thrilled to be there. Art Buchwald, as the master of ceremonies for the pet show, which was a big fundraiser for a foundation in Washington, D.C., with Max dressed up like Art. And the invitation from Joe and Lee to go to Europe that summer instead of working another summer at the Cape. And so we did. There's Lee and Joe in our car and our tent. And on the trip, we went back to the Olympic swimming pool. So that's the Rome Olympics pool. And I did a few laps in it. Okay. So, let's see. How do I get back to a full screen? Let's go up here, full screen. So that's my introduction to the book. I want to just read one more very short section. The last sentence of the prologue. When you're over 75, you've got a lot of stories to tell and not that much time left to tell them. You've made choices and followed paths that maybe you'd like to explore again or to explain to yourself, perhaps, or to your children, your grandchildren, your curious students who asked so long ago. Get busy, I advise. No time to waste. I would say to all of you, get busy. A memoir does not have to be a book that's published. A memoir can be a story like Truman Capote's A Christmas Memory, where you take a special holiday that you've celebrated with your family or a special food, and you just tell that story. And that may be all you need to do to be the beginning of something meaningful that you leave. Yeah, so that's all I have to say. And I'm open for questions. I see there's something in chat.
Yeah. So if people want to come back on screen, thank you, Carolyn. If everybody wants to come back and You can go off, but come back on camera, get off, or, stop muting yourselves, and we can take, as Carolyn said, if anybody has questions or anything you want to say. Pregnant pause. Okay, Jeannie.
My housemate took a course at the Hollywood Senior Center about memoirs, and they were publishing or are making putting things on paper of their lives as memoirs for just family. But I've been talking lately to a few people in the village who feel like we've promised, like you said, you promised your curious students. We've promised various people that our stories connect not just to our families, but often to other people, and people who would, like, I was thinking of the people I went to grad school with. I still meet with them once a month on Zoom. And the connections I promised, the things in my life that seemed to resonate with things that they'd either researched or were expert in themselves or so on. So I owe people a lot of stuff that's now on stacks and stacks of messy handwriting. And I need more than just to write them down or, type them up for children. I really, my daughter is only under 30 and she doesn't really want to go through paper, but I need to do that. And there's so much involved in this, making those connections and getting it written down and sending it to people. Some of us have been talking about that feeling like we forgot to do something we had better do
Yeah.
before it's too late.
I absolutely know what you're talking about. And there's nothing harder than to sit down and actually consolidate some of those papers and make it readable for someone, and then do the next one. And I'm trying to start a new project. Well, I've been talking about it for a year and a half, and so far I have lots of this kind of stuff and this and things that I have in my pocket when I go for walks. I am going to be in Iceland for a month where there's only going to be 5 hours of daylight. And I figure, okay, there's not going to be anything to do except, and for me, that's what I have to do. I have to get away from my house in order to be productive. Or I find things to do like vacuuming.
Write an
I
email.
do think in terms of memoir is limiting your palette, that you're only going to tell something about one topic or one story, and it might just be for one person. And that could be you. And somehow that makes it easier for me.
Anne Lamott talks about this in a book called Bird by Bird, about just biting off one bite at a time and then moving on, but not till you're finished with the first thing.
Right.
And eventually you have a bunch of little things and they're kind of finished in of themselves, and you can figure out a way to make them hang together.
Absolutely. And that's a good point, because I think that my writing started with my students, where I would write with them. We would have 10 minutes in class. I would get the prompt, we'd write, and I would do it 3 periods in a row. So I can't tell you how many times I have told the Columbus Day storm story. And yet it's not appeared in any of my books. But maybe it will when I write about this house, but there's something about, maybe there'll be a whole chapter on just disasters that happened around the house, but I don't know that yet. And it's not until I start getting those pieces as I said, it's like being a detective. You start to see, oh, look at this pattern. Look at how many times this comes up in my memory, or this person comes up in my memory, or this food preparation. You know, I keep saying that I have this idea that I want to take a few of her recipe cards that she wrote by hand, and tell a story of one time that we had that lobster thermidor, even though we had it, you know, every whatever, when the bridge club came over or something. I have yet to write the story, but I can feel it coming. The book, Annie Lamont, is good, but she's kind of to me, she's overwhelming. The book that I found most helpful when I actually was trying to pull things together was Judith Barrington's book on memoir.
Yes.
It's just so practical, so just every question that you have is answered. And she also gives multiple examples. Of course, it's a bit dated now, but I'm not sure that the memoirs that are coming out now that are bestsellers are necessarily ones that we might be writing. It seems to me that in order to sell, you have to have a trauma that out-traumas the book before. And if you read some of the older memoirs, like Frank McCourt or Russell Baker, they speak more to me. But I had a very privileged life, so I'm not disparaging the trauma. But I do think our models sometimes would be better to look further back for me.
I'm just going to read a comment that was put in the chat. Someone said, I'm just processing my time from 67 to 70. So many stories. I take your recommendation to heart. Start now. No tapes, but good memories.
Yeah. You know, I think I didn't know what a memoir was when I started. It took almost 2 years for me to have somebody actually say, you know, a memoir is just a little wedge of time, and then your reflection on it now. And I thought, oh, that's what memoir is? It's not like, oh, my whole life. Here's my timeline. So that.
Wasn't it a relief to hear that?
It certainly wasn't. I thought, well, you have to throw away all this stuff? No, you just save it for another book or an article or an essay or a letter.
One thing that I've been doing to Portland Community College for like adult education stuff. They've been having this is one class was in presenting a story as a performance, you know, from your own life.
Yeah,
and I find that type of so I've written several stories now from my life that are basically stand-up comedy routines, but they're accurate descriptions of things that have happened in my life. And so I think we all have different ways that help us to get through that process.
absolutely.
Me, as a person who likes getting up, making people laugh, and it's interestingly, the most tragic, horrible things that at the time just seemed incredibly unbearable make the funniest stories.
Huh. Interesting.
There's some, yeah, the distance from it and being able to put things in perspective and expressing the drama that I went through at the time and how it felt. It seems so ludicrous now, you know, in lots of ways. So it's kind of like tragic comedy, you know, you feel both of those things, pathos, are happening at the same time. But what I find for me personally, without that performance element, and I guess that's why they have groups like writing groups.
Yeah,
get to read to each other. But without that type of thing, I just don't do it, or I just revise indefinitely. But if I have an audience, then it's interesting how quickly I can get through things. Yeah.
Good. Yeah,
Carolyn,
I think part of the process is finding what works for each of us.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Carolyn, can you, I know you've recently taught some memoir writing workshops.
Yes.
Can you tell us who were your students and And how did that go?
Oh gosh, well, it was a continuing ed class at Lewis and Clark, and I would say maybe half were teachers, and of that half, they were teachers nearing the end of their career, but there were some younger ones, and then there were people who just take writing classes through Lewis and Clark frequently, who were older. I had, in each section, I had a friend, someone who I taught with in one, and one who I know in another. In the second one, she's a painter, and she is writing about the Cascade AIDS Project in Portland and her involvement, volunteering with that, coupled with these paintings from photos of that time, which is, I think, is going to be extraordinary. There's not a lot of text that she's writing. I do use a prompt, and some of you, this might be helpful, and it's from William Stafford, and it was a poetry prompt for him, which was to draw a bird's eye view either of your bedroom, that was where you slept under the age of 10, or your neighborhood under the age of 10. And then kind of like a Hardy Boys or a Nancy Drew map. And then to kind of locate 10 to 15 specialty places where pets lived in the neighborhood, or your playmates, or the bully, the nice lady, all those kinds of details, and then to begin to tell little stories about them. Well, I taught this class maybe 5 years ago at Multnomah Arts Center, and somebody who had grown up in the Midwest posted her map with her route to school on Facebook. And all of a sudden she had all these responses from people who were remembering, well, what about my house? Or what about, remember that time when we did such and such and such and such? And she said it became this sort of neighborhood map that had multiple stories going on it. And her goal, which is interesting for the guy that just spoke, she wanted to write stories that would make her brother laugh. Mm-hmm. And so she went to her map and began to find the stories that would entertain her. And I don't know if it was her older brother or her little brother. But I think if you begin to play with your stories, you'll find what is most rewarding to you to be writing about.
Yeah.
I think we have time for maybe one more question, or anybody have anything you want to ask?
I would keep my eyes open if you really are interested in who's teaching classes or where. Sometimes libraries will have classes, the community college. There's something about paying something to take a class that makes me responsible in a way that if I just sign up and I don't feel any responsibility to it, I might not do anything. So if you make a commitment, maybe just to attend a few times and come up with something, you'll find that you have something to say.
That's great. So is our time up, Terry? I think so. Well, Carolyn, this has been fabulous.
Thank you so much.
We've all enjoyed it so much, and thank you. And can we all thank her with a round of applause? Everyone, yay! Turn on your whatever so we can hear. But anyway,
bravo.
Yes, that's a good one. That's a good one.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thanks everyone.
Right.
Everybody.